what more can I say? Please welcome Ashley Smith.
Thanks so much, Jen. I also did want to just thank John and Rebecca for saying yes in Hallwalls. And they generously held space for me to do this, to do this work. So I'm eternally grateful for it. Hopefully I can figure out the clicker. Step one. Okay, so I've included this image of this really special place from my childhood to start with. And I'm a Buffalo-based artist, and I've been living and working here for 10 years, but I am not from here. So I am from this place, really. This is like my childhood home. I grew up in a town called Cohocton. It's really little. And this is a family stomping ground that we lovingly refer to as the pond. And I am showing this space because it is a wild space. It is a space that I feel I was enveloped into. And the space itself seems to have its own kind of vital life force. And I feel it just influenced a lot of what I do, in the way that I observed this place every summer, through spring, summer, and fall, and the environment shifted in its natural rhythms, and it would change color, the surfaces would change, the way that the shapes of the space changed, and I think also the way that I come to material even this space influenced the way I come to material and just play. For example, my great aunts and uncles, I would go camp there with them, and they would give me cups, and I would gather water from the pond with these cups, and I would run all around the land just sort of pouring water on all the surfaces that I could find, just to see what would happen, to understand the forms, and even like mixing the mud into the water and see how then that would change, which that seems weird to be doing, I suppose, but I think it was my way of understanding all the space around me. And that's essentially what I'm doing now. I pour liquid on things and it changes. So I think, and then also just the last thing I would say about this space is that I think I still am pulling a lot of like natural forms and organic growths that I think I observed in this space. Just something even like a frog egg. And the way that, the way that those are put under the water, and you have to sort of look into this space to find all those little treasures and all those shapes. And at the same time, I was also thinking about how this space supports life, but it also takes life. Like just going back even to the frog eggs, you could watch the life in the eggs moving, but then the fish would come and eat them. And so it was simultaneously supporting life, and it was also very harsh. And I think that those are ideas that are present in the work that I've always done, and in particular now. So not far from that space is where I went to college, Alfred University. That's where I got my BFA. And I did end up studying sculpture and ceramics. And this is just work for my senior show, which it just feels like a million years ago. But I'm showing it, the maquettes, these maquettes are upstairs as well, some of these. And it's just the first time I made the deliberate choice to use these materials, and so that's why I've added these images. Also, I was there and I did a lot of ceramics, and the actual discipline of how to approach form was really helpful, but then I just had this sort of practical feeling about once I graduated, what was I gonna do? Like, it was gonna be hard to find a kiln and find the space, and I thought, well, if I could just have a white small room, I could make anything if I'm using these everyday materials like sponges and glue and string and foam and joint compound and paint, and I could just keep making things easily, and I just didn't want anything to get in my way after I left college. So that's what these are for. And then also I've added these just to show like just how I formally approach material and space and three-dimensional objects. And these are they're all small. They would fit kind of here-ish. So, while I was there, I was introduced to the artist Eva Haase, and I'm showing this as an influence. The way that she uses color is sort of powerful and sensual. The way that she uses everyday materials like rope, and she would put latex on rope, and like any material was available, and it didn't matter if it was archival. Like it was all allowed. And then also I talked about color. Oh, yeah, I talked about color, and I talked about 2D to 3D in material. Those are the main things that were influencing me with her. But also, she's just sort of like this soulful artist who I feel like, I don't know, some kind of sister connection or something from beyond, I guess. And then another artist that at the time and still influences me is Kathy Butterly. These are very tiny, this size. I'm really bad with numbers, so I kind of just do things like this. Maybe no more than 5 or 6 inches in any direction, and they're porcelain. And I saw her show, and I think what I was struck by, obviously there's this immaculate craft and attention to detail on the surface, but then also I'm struck by how she creates such movement, but the form is fixed. It's not really going anywhere, but you can tell what the action is, and then there's a story within that action. And I think I'm trying to do those kinds of things. I think that I'm doing those things you'll see them up in the gallery. Okay. These pieces, I'm kind of just going in a chronological order of when I made things. I never really showed these. I mean, I have a friend who bought this one right here. It's called Sugar on Top of Salt on Top of Fat. And it was the first time that I sort of recognized that I had this ability or this interest in researching a topic, and I could infuse it into an abstract form. And I was reading about sort of how food is engineered and how and I was reading about how the food industry literally uses sugar and salt and fat in layers because we're biologically hardwired to want those things, and they basically, it's like turning our food into a science experiment to make it highly palatable. And I guess I am judging that situation. Like, I didn't like how that felt, but I decided, well, I can do simple things, like I can use primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, to represent sugar on top of salt on top of fat, and I can highly layer the materials. And it was also the first time I started really working. I mean, I always was working on the wall. Things were coming out of the wall, but this was sort of the first movement where I was experimenting with incorporating the wall, and the pieces had started to grow. And because this was about the body, it was starting to become more, there was more of a relationship between the wall and the sculpture and the body. And I think, and then if I could just move over to the other piece, that this was just, I had a friend who was saying, well, it kind of does have to be archival. Like, it kind of would help if your sculptures held up and if they were, if they could last. And so this was also the first time that I started using resin over the top of this very same materials that I was using. So I was experimenting, even though it's like sort of this awkward canvas with blobs on it, it doesn't, you know, it has a long way to go at this point to be sort of balanced, but it was just, I just put it in here as just showing that I was sort of honing my process a little more conceptually, but also technically. So at this point, I was in grad school, not an MFA. I was getting my teaching degree, and I was also making work at the same time, and the work really shifted at this point. Like, the concepts were getting darker and heavier and more monumental, but so was the size of the work. So this painted panel of the body is 8 feet by 4 feet, and the sculpture is about, it's taller than me. It's about 7 foot tall, and it's the first time where I really started paying attention to, again, a deeper relationship with the work and the body. It's also the first time I started exploring oil painting and to sort of create more variety in my surfaces. And it's also a point at which I was really exploring archetype for the first time, and symbolism within the body and within the sculpture. So this one with the flaming head is called Ripples of Hurt, and this other one is called The Hills Can't Save Us Now. And it is undeniably dark, for sure. And I think that, you know, the Hills Can't Save Us Now is based on that old saying, like, run for the hills. But sometimes you have to face things that are hard. And I think also what I learned from these pieces and from my process is that sometimes you make the things and you don't know what they mean. And you have to sort of do some work to figure it out. And so after a lot of time went by, I think what I realized is that I was doing this process that Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who writes Women Who Run with the Wolves, that making descansos is a process to honor a death of some kind. So commonly, they're to honor like an automobile accident. But in this book, I learned of this idea where every person sort of has these little deaths that occur in their life, large and small. And what the sculpture for me at this point was sort of looking at what those deaths were, honoring them, and then leaving them in the sculpture, like as a marking place, and to just let it lie there, basically. So this piece is called Paranoid Land. So this sort of catches us up to the newest work. And this started with, again, like as a jumping off point from that other dark work, I got this idea of spiritual rotting. And I ended up creating this collage with the apple, and it is rotting fruit as a symbol for this archetypal image, and it kind of holds that idea for what spiritual rotting might be. And the question that I sort of was chasing after was, how does one transcend spiritual rotting, and what good can come from it? So again, this is one of those images where it just came, and I sort of had to follow the clues. And so I was looking at the apple and making associations towards the Maiden. And all of the different mythologies that I had read. And so this is when I sort of also started figuring out that I'm kind of layering mythology and my own personal narratives, and then of course doing that in sculptural form. And so I discovered this archetype called the Triple Goddess. And that's where the title of the show comes from, Threefold Form, is this idea of a female goddess who is mother, maiden, and crone. And that they fold into one goddess. So, and it's like a universal myth that sort of represents, for those of you who don't know, like the life stages of womanhood, and the idea of that particular archetype is that you can call upon any of those stages at any point in your life to do different things, to work through things. So this is the Golden Maiden, and I'm just pointing out that, and then here when I look at those images, I mean, the truth is I don't relate to those female images. Like, they're kind of overly sexualized, and I don't personally relate to those, but there's value in using ideas from them. But I think and this is like really new work for me. I mean, I feel like I literally just finished it days ago, so I'm gonna do my best to talk about it. But I mean, in terms of color, I kind of feel like, I'm using that archetype because traditionally the maiden is austera, is pink, and it's a symbol of new life and new growth. And there's the two other pieces, mother, but I haven't titled this one mother. It's actually titled Rosero, which is a carnivorous species of plant that had evolved to live off of bugs because there wasn't enough nutrients in the ground for what it needed. So, and then the last one is the crone. And so in these sculptures, I mean, you can see that the colors are drawn from the archetype, if you look back at this image. And then also some of the forms there, like if this one is obvious, I included the apple. But so in these particular pieces, I mean, that's like the main influence for these. And I guess because I feel like time is ticking, I'm gonna because you can look at those upstairs. Everyone always wants to know how's it made. So I'm just gonna show a couple of images of the armatures, and I'm using still all of the same materials, but I just feel like I've really developed how I work with these, and I do feel like I've just gotten really good at manipulating the material. So I'm using mesh screen and foam and bits and baubles and Easter eggs and paper and string still. I cover it in resin and I sand it a lot. And I paint it. And because it's large, I do have a drawing process where I photograph the works and I draw into them to play around with color, so I'm just not wasting materials and paint. And this is sort of, to me, how it references that first image, the land, where I feel like I'm making sculpture that's enveloping you, like physically when you stand up to it, but there's all sorts of small places that are like treasure. And I'm literally using beads and glitter and making those special moments in the piece. And then I install it, which completely is a different experience. So those were all just my studio. This is a very small wall, and you really can't get the full sense of the object until it's installed. And then I guess I would the final thoughts I have at this point, which I'm sure I'll, 10 years later, have totally different thoughts on this, but at this point, this is the Golden Maiden, and this part of the archetype is all about creating new life. And I guess where before I felt like I was making descansos, which there's some of that going on, I do feel like these are now almost like resurrection sites where they are, you honoring whatever has died and using those creative energies to make new life in new forms that would be completely unexpected. So that's it.